Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to Women and Girls with Nowhere to Go. My name is Lauren Bone. I am the legal director of Women's Liberation Front, and I'm here to talk to you about this very important topic tonight. Um, for starters, who are women with nowhere to go? There are a couple of ways that this looks. We think of places that have physical custody, like in the state, so prisons and jail, including juvenile facilities. But this also includes places like hospitals, nursing homes, other inpatient facilities where people don't have freedom of movement. Um, and this includes things like immigration detention centers as well. Um, and then there's an overlap with that in legal custody, which is where you don't make the rules about where you can and can't go. So maybe you can physically have more movement, but there's consequences for using that freedom of movement. And so within the correctional system, that also includes probation and parole. That includes foster care and group homes. For immigration, it includes having visas that determine where you can go and the different rules around how you can work, where you can live, outpatient mental health and substance abuse facilities. And and then there's also going on the other end where you have some choice. You have cost barriers to being able to have freedom of movement. You can have temporary things like everyone goes through security in airports. And so that's a situation in which you don't at that moment have control over where you're going or what you're doing. And then minors in the educational system as well are not in a place where they have choice. So there's also, this is not a static system either, obviously. People move throughout their lives in between these different categories or can. And there's something we look at as like a non-compliance punishment pipeline where if you don't do these right things or if you have bad luck or all these other things, it can move you from having some choice back towards having no choice. And so it's a whole sort of framework of looking at these things. And so different laws and policies have a huge effect on women's safety and privacy and other exercise of their rights in these scenarios. So single sex spaces are important. And how do they disappear is a question. So how do we get to a point where there are not single sex spaces? One of them is just having sex discrimination be illegal, sex discrimination being defined as the government treating men and women differently based on sex. And that can be as simple as having sex separation. A lot of times in the US, there's not actually protections for single sex spaces. They might be done as a matter of practice. We might think of them as being legal or legally protected, but they aren't necessarily. And when it comes down to it, there is sometimes limited ability to prohibit men from entering women's spaces. Um, and so sometimes we see that happen. It's typically under this category less of an issue with like bathrooms, locker rooms, and stuff, but it is more of an issue if you think about things like gyms that might have um, like women only hours, or you have things like prisons are a big thing where a lot of states don't actually have anything on the books which says that women will be housed in separate facilities. So what you end up having is we've always done things a certain way because it's the smart way to do it, or maybe not always, but have done things for a long time that way. But when it comes down to challenges, there's not that solid standing for it. So, and even when courts have a history of upholding these things, a lot of times that framework falls apart either legally or just ideologically when a male comes in and claims female status. So a man saying he's a man, but he doesn't think it's fair to have this discrimination is one thing. But then coming in and saying, actually, I'm a woman and you should consider me a woman under the law, that has tended to really cause an upheaval in courts, notably in sports context as well. So here's the other place that we get into problems. Legal sex change. So that is where laws have, when you have the ability to do it, but it's based on, some argue, legal sex. So what's listed on your documents, what the government considers you. And that looks differently depending on where you are, and it looks different over time too. So you can start out as, a lot of times it used to be, if you had surgery, or you'd have to get these attestations from your doctor and doing all these things, and then you could go and get a court order and change your legal sex. That has its own problems, major problems as well. But even that, those steps are increasingly not even being, necessary, depending on the state. So a lot of times now they feel like that burden was too high. They want to make it easier in a couple ways. They want to make it so that, um, you don't actually have to have any surgery, any medical steps, anything like that. And they want to make it so that you don't have to. So, it's literally just the stated sex, and don't have to go to court anymore. A lot of places you really just have to sign an affidavit. Some of these places, a lot of states, you can just do it online, fill out a form. And a lot of states let you do a non-binary identity. So you don't even have to choose male or female. You can choose something like X, or things like that, or maybe even not having one listed. And in those places, it is almost universally, a person can choose whether a male or female, being treated as male or female under the law, best aligns with their non-binary identity. So that is a problem, because that also gets more fundamentally at the issue of single sex spaces. Um, the other thing, and this is its own challenge, is characterizing or recharacterizing a space or service from one that serves women and girls to calling it something else. So saying this is for women and other non-men, or this is for things of that nature, because then they run completely against, having to justify, you know, definition of sex or things like that, and they can simply say this is this larger bucket. This is harder to fight against when you don't have explicit protections that say you have to have this single sex spaces. And then the other thing is there's imposing rules and conditions on use of a space and service. So a lot of this looks like speech codes, or places like shelters might have rules about, being required to use pronouns or things like that. And so you, not only that, but you aren't allowed to dissent. You aren't allowed to say, I'm not comfortable with this, or I'm not, um, sometimes implicitly, usually explicitly, there's rules on that. And the other thing is there's just, this runs through those, but the lack of legal guidance. So you have private institutions that have cultural and social pressures. If they're an NGO, they might have, donations, funders who have rules on, non-discrimination policies, things like that. And you just have the people who are running it making decisions. And so it runs the gamut from government mandates that women can't have things of their own to just, we see how it happens. What are some of the problems? We have problems with losing privacy, dignity, in places where you're unclothed. There's physical safety, emotional safety, when you're dealing with generally traumatized populations, especially when you're talking about physical custody, people who don't want to be where they are and have no choice about it. That's a huge problem. You end up with, loss of access. So even if there was no problem with any of this, you have someone taking a spot. And so you're more likely to, if you look at it like a shelter, more likely to have someone who just has nowhere, literally nowhere to go. Like they're just stuck, even if all these other things weren't a problem. A huge deal is there are things like shelters, homeless shelters. There's there's co-ed shelters, right? There's ones where families can stay together, or there's ones where they have like a male wing and a female wing and things like that. But single sex facilities are not designed physically or procedurally, like with policies, to operate in that way. And so it's a problem. So Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA here, one of the things we noticed when we were looking last year at California prisons is that they have a whole audit team that do audits every year, and they have different ones doing different places, and they were logging them as different things. So the California Institution for Women, which is the smaller women's prison, was called a single sex, it was called a women's prison, like, and it was marked as like single sex. And the one for Central California Women's Facility was marked as having male and female. And it's not even clear what they're referring to, because right now California logs their prisoners by gender identity, by their stated gender identity. So, you know, even though we know there's like 40 to 50 male offenders in these facilities, it says hundreds because they're not even counting those males, they're counting female prisoners who identify as male. So it's totally useless information for our purposes of safeguarding. But, you know, just even looking at those, they're using different criteria to evaluate, you know what I mean? So when you look at the audits, the one auditor who's looking at the one place is using criteria for single sex facilities, and the one other one is using for mixed sex, which is how it should be. If you have male and females together, it should be looked at as a mixed sex facility, but they're not always doing that, and there's no requirement for them to do that. So yeah, there's other consequences of dissent. So taking this away means you're at greater risk of problems associated with being around men, especially if you don't want to be. And that is, might have to defend yourself. You, like, either physically or otherwise. You might have to leave, and you might lose whatever financial, like if you're talking about a shelter, you might have not have any money or anywhere else to go. Literally things like that. So how do I can't go forward. I don't know why I can't go forward on my thing. Oh, there we go. Okay. This is a big one. So we think of prisons and jails, right? So, and the big problems we got. What are the problems with gender ID policies in prisons and jails? We've got who has access to you. So we think of male inmates being housed with them, and that is huge. That is the hugest piece of it. You've also got, you know, there's a rule that says that it has to be a same-sex staff member who's doing pat downs and searches, including strip searches and cavity searches, unless there's an emergency. And now we have self-ID in these places. So you not only have, you could theoretically have male guards who are IDing as women and doing that. I haven't heard of that happening. What we do hear about happening a lot is male inmates in male facilities self-IDing, or as women or gender fluid or whatever, to have female guards being the ones who are patting them down, doing their cavity searches, doing their strip searches, and all of that. So it's a huge workers' rights issue as well. And medical staff as well. This, again, this applies to, you know, it goes both ways, right? So you have the female staff, but you also have the you know, the women who are seeking medical care in there. One of the big things is that we're seeing in Wolf's case, Chandler versus CDCR, which I'll talk about more in a second, but access to justice. Like, what happens when you complain? What are you able to do? How can you say, I'm not okay with this, or this is violating my rights? And you can't just sue. You can't just go to court and sue. You actually have to go through this grievance process. In California, it's a 602 process, and you have to exhaust it. This is a federal law that requires you to go through the entire internal grievance process and consider it exhausted before you can file. And that's really a big barrier, especially when you have things like someone saying, like one of our plaintiffs did, that they want a single sex facility to be in so that she's safe from sexual assault. And their response was essentially, you're in one. And what do you do with that, right? And so functionally, like, we have a First Amendment right to petition our government for redress of our grievances. This is the grievance process. That's how they're supposed to be petitioning the government. And they're denying the facts of what's there. And so it has really big practical considerations. I also wanted to give a nod to voting. Some people don't know in our country that generally felons can't vote. People who are convicted of felonies There's in almost every state, they can't do it. And some states, you can't even vote after you're done with your sentence. But in some places, you can get it back. It might not even be automatic, but you've got the people, the women who are subject to these policies are precluded from voting until they're done being subject to the policies, and sometimes ever. So you can't even have, women who have been out and are done with their parole, done with probation, done with supervision. And so it's 4.4 million people in this country can't vote because of their criminal record. And it's has major effects. Um, some places, juvenile facilities have different rules, often not. Um, this is skipping back from voting over just to the general rules. But I also wanted to mention that juvenile facilities also receive Title IX funding because they have to educate the juveniles in their custody. And so it is impacted by the rules that come down from there too. Um, so that is something. I mentioned, petitioning the government for redress of grievances. The other First Amendment thing that comes up really is freedom of speech. And they meaning correctional systems in California and elsewhere, have kind of gone out of their way to not officially go after and say you have to use preferred pronouns with women in there. But functionally, they do. You can see California accused one of the plaintiffs in Chandler of willfully misgendering the man who assaulted her, and uh, and then claimed that they never told her that she couldn't say whatever she wanted. There's obviously issues with both free exercise of religion for women who have to be um, in single sex environments privately. But then there's also just the issues that come from state adoption of some really quasi-religious beliefs about like the nature of a soul, and does a soul have a sex, and can it be something that, these are spiritual ideas, right? And so they have no place being implemented by law. And the other big thing obviously is Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. Unfortunately, in the correctional setting in the US, there is no bright line rule that says women deserve to have the right to have single sex environments. Even just in general, even putting this aside, it's all been mostly a matter of practice. A lot of states actually have it in there that it's supposed to be a single sex, there will be women's prisons and that it's separate, but it's not framed usually as an entitlement, something that you could have a right of action to sue if you are being denied it. And that is something that is, uh, you know, that's an issue too. And it can be a barrier to this. So what we look at is the Eighth Amendment says you cannot be subject to cruel and unusual punishment for your crimes. And so there are many circumstances that in which these conditions can be considered cruel and unusual punishment. And there's precedent for, uh, elevated, foreseeable, predictable, preventable risk of sexual assault itself is an Eighth Amendment violation, as well as the psychological anguish that goes along with that exposure to that. This is a group of women who are 85 to 90% have histories of domestic violence or sexual violence. This is a group of women at huge rates of PTSD, of complex PTSD. Uh, it's a very vulnerable population. And so this is exposure to extreme stress over a long period of time. And believe strongly it's an Eighth Amendment violation, and we're hoping that the court agrees. The other thing is, the 14th Amendment requires equal protection under the law. And there's two ways that we, believe that that's being violated as well in the context of mixed sex prison policies. One of them is on the basis of sex, because functionally what's happening is you're denying women single sex um, rehabilitative opportunities, and men aren't being denied that because for two reasons. One, they don't rely on it the way that women do. They don't need necessarily the same distance from the opposite sex to heal themselves. Women need a single sex environment. They do best there in healing. There's lots of studies on that. Um, the studies, the people who run them and the people who implement those findings don't agree as to whether they apply to males who identify as women, but there's a lot of data showing that women need these environments. And then the other equal protection is basically people who believe that they have a gender identity and people who don't. And that is a place we're seeing just a lot of different privileges, different rules applying. Um, the Prison Rape Elimination Act is a federal law that was passed. It's about 25 years old, and it has done a lot of good things that have helped cut down on rape in the men's facilities, and which is good. But what we're seeing it used now is to transfer that risk over to women's facilities because the regulations that go along with it anticipate the possibility of mixed sex housing, of cross sex housing, of it doesn't say some people will be are allowed to be housed, some male offenders are allowed to be housed in women's facilities, but it does say when you're choosing which facility you go in, and allows for that, and it requires or it prohibits third spaces. So the reason for that being it is seen within the men's facilities as a kind of punishment. Basically, you're punishing the victim, the person that's at disproportionate risk of sexual violence, instead of holding the perpetrators or potential perpetrators to account for keeping that safety. But when it's in the women's facility, what you see in California, for example, is women aren't allowed to say they don't want to, share with them. They're not allowed to put them on a special wing. They're not allowed to just put them in cells together. And you have people of the opposite sex sharing cells, and it's major problems. So we have now confirmed pregnancies, including pregnancies that occurred after incarceration. So previously you'd hear about pregnancies and they'd be like, yeah, but they might have been pregnant when they got here, right? And so they've been very coy in the past about confirming some of these things, but now the prison in California did confirm that there is someone who is currently pregnant who became pregnant there. And because it's private medical information, they won't answer questions about paternity or anything, but and we also know that there is someone facing two rape charges. So that is also now been acknowledged by the state, maybe not the prison. I don't know their position on it, but certainly the local DA is charging with 2 counts of forcible rape and 1 count of dissuading a witness. And there is a preliminary hearing on May 3rd for that. And that is someone who is also serving time for prior sex offenses. And of note, is not considered a sex offender because he was not convicted of the sex crime. He was convicted of the underlying kidnapping charge. So came up earlier in a conversation internally here, and someone said, so these are underreported numbers. Yes. 1/3 of those being transferred in California are sex offenders, of the male offenders being transferred, which compares to between 10 and 15% sex offenders of the general male population incarcerated. So it's very disproportionate to the trans identified population in there. On the federal level, it's 50%. That's consistent internationally with what we've seen out of the UK and other countries. There was a report from Canada that I think it was even higher than 50%. There is a lot of questions about this. And the Biden administration, their Bureau of Prisons, has acknowledged it and has said that they believe that self-ID is one factor that they're looking at. So this is, Biden ran on in 2020 ran on, the prison doesn't tell you who you are, and even this administration, you get in there and everything else they're doing, Title IX, they're throwing it away, and all these other things, but they've been very shy at the federal level about enforcing this. And I think they got in and looked at the numbers and aren't quite sure what to do. Um, so that's my take on that. Um, so I think I'm sure people will have questions about this, but I'm going to get through this. The other thing people rarely talk about, and I really think part of this is just such a lack of visibility, is the various facets of the immigration system. Um, it's one of those things that the majority of the people who are impacted by this have reason not to talk about it publicly, or there's a lot of, when you're talking about people who are in physical custody, they have even less access to the outside world as people in prison, and there's language barriers and there's things like that. So the enforcement and removal operations runs the what they call those non-citizens who are subject to removal or are unlawfully present in the US. That is, they're responsible for arresting, detaining, and removing them. One of the things that I think is not the common misconception, is that what we're talking about is not all of the people in here also are undocumented either. So this includes, not that that matters for the conditions people are held in, but I just think it's interesting common misconceptions. A lot of these are people who have presented themselves for asylum, are seeking refugee status. Some people went and presented themselves at the border to border agents. And so there's it's way beyond the scope of this, but just to flag it, that there's a lot of the same problems with the detention facilities, many of which are use jails and prisons as well, when they're talking about removing, people who have been accused or convicted of crimes. But these are facilities that are, we don't really have visibility into what's going on, but we do know that there's a lot of variation in how they're housing people and based on self-ID. And a lot of these too, there's kids housed with adults and things like that. And it's really a dangerous situation if you have especially adult men who are with kids, especially unaccompanied minors. So that is people, minors who come over the border or are in the US who do not have their parents with them. So some of these kids are staying with family who are in the US, some are in foster care, and some are in, so those first two kind of fall into that legal custody of the state. They are subject to the authority of the state in terms of their movement, their activities, who is caring for them. And some of them are in state care. Some of them are at these detention centers. Some of them are in group homes and things like that. So one of the big pieces of that is this, child transitioning stuff. And so we see that, there, if the government is making, we know how they handle foster care and things. We see in some states, in California is a lot of the bluer states are these, you can lose custody of your kids for not agreeing to so-called gender affirming care, not agreeing to let them take puberty blockers, hormones, or even have surgeries. And so you have these family members who might not have a lot of necessarily sophistication in dealing with the immigration system, who are in this place of wanting to keep these vulnerable family members who are children with them, and are in a place where they're being told that they have to do these things to keep them. We don't have a lot of information about situations of this happening, much less than I would expect, because I really think that there's just such a lack of visibility here. And that's just people who they're looking to detain and remove people. There's also a lot of issues with the legal custody. So you have people who are here on visas, and a visa is essentially, for the most part, you're here, but there's rules you have to follow. One big one is international students, I'll just say, and that has all the same things with Title IX. So you want to object to, the sports or sharing locker rooms or speech codes, things like that, you don't want to get in trouble with the school because you can lose your ability to be at that school, in which case, if you're not at that school, you're not able to stay here legally. Although there is a little bit of flexibility in terms of transferring schools, but you'd have to have the foresight to want to like break all the rules and transfer. And they're all subject to the same Title IX rules anyway, for the most part, schools. In contrast, H-1 visas are for workers, and H-1A visas are for farm workers, and H-1B visas are specialized occupations. And so that is the vast majority of the people who get those work in tech, which is a big deal because tech employers are notoriously extreme on gender identity policies, including things like speech codes and discrimination conduct things. If you are here on an H-1 visa and you quit your job or lose your job, you have to go. It is not easy to get on another thing. You can't just say, they don't say, oh, you got, 90 days to find a new job. No, you have to go through the whole process again because that employer is your sponsor. As to the farm worker visas, I will say that there's all the same problems with the they're not the wokest employers, right? And so there's a lot of other problems related to wrongful, basically imprisonment and sexual abuse and horrible things going on there. It's unlikely to be, it's just gender identity policies are not likely to be behind a lot of those issues, but that is a whole can of worms. Just like sort of the sex trafficking problem with immigration in general, is the scope is staggering, really. A U visa is one that someone who's on another visa can apply for if they are a victim of a crime, of certain enumerated crimes, or are a witness to it. And I mention this because one of the issues we've seen in courts has been mandating witnesses and victims and other people, litigants, to be using certain phrasing, doing things in a certain way. So you could end up, the big condition of getting a U visa is full cooperation with the prosecution of the crime that you are a victim of or witness to. And so that can really run up against, some of these other things. We've seen judges in the US and in the UK say, you can't call this person. There's these rules in different states about, you have to use preferred pronouns, you have to respect the gender identity. So you could have a rape victim who's being forced to say she in testifying against her assailant. So not good, guys. Shelters. So homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers. These are all things that federally are covered under funding. So Title VI is a funding mechanism. So that's where they say you have to have discrimination. Sex is not prohibited under Title VI, sex discrimination, which means you can have things like women's shelters because it's not considered discriminatory against men. You can discriminate against men in federal funding. You can have a facility or a service that caters exclusively to women because it's not illegal to discriminate against men. However, first Obama and now Biden have said that, for these, which falls under, a lot of these falls under HUD, the Housing and Urban Development. There's a lot of funding through there that they're required to admit based on gender identity. And that has been very devastating for trying to maintain, because it means you have to forego federal funding if you don't want to open up your facility in that way. And the same goes for states in terms of funding strings, but states also have the power, arguably, to have mandates that are not tied to funding. Federal policies are often, just because of more limited scope of federal power, a lot of times they have to tie it to the money. Not so much with states necessarily. You can just be required to as a matter of, discrimination. I see I have proposed rule here. There was a proposed rule under that Trump had proposed and had gone as far as to do the whole notice of proposed rulemaking. We went through the public comment process. They were going to finalize it, and then they just didn't. So that was a major disappointment right at the end. And then obviously when the new administration came in, they scrapped it. So I wanted to shout out Lundy Bancroft, he's a writer. He does battering men's programs or whatever. He does services to try to rehabilitate batterers. Wrote a great book called Why Does He Do That? About the various ways in which domestic violence can present itself, male violence specifically. He has argued, he's one of the few more mainstream voices that I've heard argue both against gender identity policies and not from a philosophical level, right? Like we have problems with it from a philosophical standpoint of undermining women's rights and from these practical standpoints, and it's both of these things. And so this technocratic perspective of like, this makes no sense, you can't do it. And that's a huge thing. He's getting, attempted cancellations and such for it, but I don't think he cares. But he also in general has argued a lot against diverting funding to more gender neutral policies, because like a lot of men's rights activists will be like, well, all this funding is, men get abused too, and there's all this funding. But we know that it's a very disproportionately sex-based crime and dynamic and phenomenon. And he's argued very much against that. 638. Okay. Big deal is medical. So this runs the gamut from you can have locked wards for inpatient mental health and substance abuse, or you could have things like nursing home, assisted living in hospitals where, you're not legally stuck there, but you can't leave very easily. If you were to leave, you could be in physical danger, or you could just be unable to go have somewhere else to go. So for all intents and purposes, people are generally stuck in those places. And we don't have as many shared rooms in the US. So it's more closely like the bigger issues has to do with people who are providing care or who otherwise have access. And one of the things is, I don't know if anyone's heard the term bona fide occupational qualifications. That is considered an exception to rules against sex discrimination. So you can say you can't discriminate in employment on the basis of sex. And what does that mean? That doesn't just mean hiring and firing. That also means you can't say, well, the women, we want the women to do this kind of work and the men to do this kind of work, or things like that, unless it is considered a bona fide occupational qualification. And providing a female worker to do things like intimate exams, forensic exams, sexual assault forensic exams, pap smears, or even just doing, in nursing homes, doing bathing, doing, things like that, really, really intimate physical touching, people seeing you nude, very vulnerable situations. It is widely accepted that people can ask for someone of the same sex. And this is obviously tends to be more especially important to women. And so what happens with self-ID? Again, this does go both ways. This is a women's workers issue too, where you have male patients who are requiring, and they're being required to provide cares that would usually be provided by a same sex employee. And then of course you have women who might not even really be, with cognizant enough to know that they're not being provided care by someone else. But this is a really big issue with, these are already areas in which there's issues with accessed by male employees, and sexual assault, sexual harassment, and things like that, just like in the prison context, where now you're adding this additional population of people, this additional way that someone who's supposed to maybe only have tertiary access can get that right up in primary access, plausible deniability for why are you in the room right now? Why are you touching them? Things like that. And heard a lot of anecdotes from people who work at these places. And so going back to some of that spectrum of how you get there, you've got hospitals. What about outpatient, hospitals, or, you got support groups or mental health groups or substance abuse groups. Um, you know, what if you have those and you have to have policies that you follow there and being able to do these different things? Well, again, you might have a choice like I have no choice but to either submit to this or to go back to, this maybe this more additional level of care, or vice versa. If you're like, I just cannot, it's not a healing environment for me to go to one of these places like mental health and substance abuse specifically, you might then have to choose to lose out on the benefits, maybe life-saving benefits of having that inpatient level of care because you don't feel safe doing it. And so you have to choose a lower level of care, and maybe you don't get better. I mean, so these are really impactful choices that people have to make. Also, in general, special populations. So this applies not just to particular places or laws, but minors. You know, there's some wiggle room that parents have over what they do with their kids, but just a minor, they're supposed to go to school or they're truant. And it's not always better to go to a different school if you're talking about going back to the bona fide occupational qualifications. This applies for all of these. You've got overnight chaperones, who's watching, who's monitoring the, middle school and high schoolers in the locker rooms while they get dressed and shower at school. Things like that. This applies to everywhere. And so this is a female worker issue where you have, in Canada, there was, people who know Jessica, I don't remember the guy, Jonathan Yaniv, I think was his name. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but he was suing all of these spa workers who were refusing to give him services on his male parts, like waxing and things like that. And they had an anti-discrimination law there, and he was using it to bully these mostly immigrant women into touching him. So that is not something that just any old male who doesn't claim to be female can do in the same way in that place. So these are places and contexts, and it's a major issue. Students in general, so that includes minors, but also again you have students in college. Some of this is, we think of like, I've heard for dorm rooms and sororities and things like that, I've heard people say, oh, well, obviously it's not ideal, but you could just choose to do something else. Well, putting aside the fact that people shouldn't have to choose, rules get switched up. Like, we know people are not people, even individuals and institutions are not upfront about these things. This is all subterfuge. They want to do what they want and then wait for you to object, and then they can say, what are you talking about? Like, sex isn't defined by biology. What do you mean? Like, you're making a new rule, as if it's always been this other way. And so people can get into these situations, and sure, maybe you're one of those people who is like, yep, I'm willing to give up the benefits of living in the dorm or joining a sorority or whatever, but maybe you've already joined and you didn't know it was going to be crazy like this. This is what we've seen in the case we just submitted an amicus brief in back in December in Westonbrook. It was a sorority in Wyoming, and there was a lot of women already in that sorority by the time they started admitting this, allowing this man to join, this boy man, who was sexually harassing everybody and predictably, because he's a teenage boy. Um, so, and just everything. We got language barriers. So people with English as a second language who might not be able to communicate some of these needs, literacy issues, health literacy. So in the context of healthcare providers, not being able to necessarily communicate those things. The other thing is having these, the body function first language. So cervix havers, people who menstruate, things like that. Those are hugely alienating to women who might not necessarily know what a cervix is or even know the word menstruation necessarily. So, in terms of screening and communicating with populations of women who need things, um, it's a huge deal to use language that caters to people who have a comfort level issue compared to a knowledge issue. Do you know what I mean? So basically, if the reason you're using that language is to not alienate or distress someone so much that they don't seek care, and that's the public health perspective, you're sacrificing a much bigger population of people who might just not know what you're talking about, in general, especially if there's a lot of women who have English. If they have English as a second language, they rely on their kids to interpret, especially in informal settings. And so your 5-year-old doesn't know what a cervix is necessarily too. So there's a lot of that kind of thing where it's just these different barriers to communication, barriers to asserting yourself, for asking, for knowing what your rights are and things like that. And then in general, just cultural or religious beliefs about use of single sex spaces. And so, for example, while any of us might have discomfort using public bathrooms if we think that there's, might be a man in there peeping legally, there's some women who might, because of religious beliefs, that might preclude them from that perspective of going out and using those as well. So just remember, everything I already said about all those things, it's compounded when you have people who aren't able to have other barriers for sticking up for themselves or for communicating. And I want to mention, we do work on all these things. So we've got Chandler versus CDCR and other work that we do on the prison issue and filing amicus briefs in different cases on different issues, doing petitions for rulemaking, public comments, and public education efforts and things like that. And legal work is not cheap at all. And Wolf is very grateful for all donations on that. And so you should definitely give if you are not already. And also volunteering. Legal Eagles, write me, call me, legal director at womensliberationfront.org. And then just following and sharing content is a huge thing, because the more awareness there is, the more people can do the same thing. So I'm gonna go back to that first slide and then I can take questions. I see that there's like 76 comments or questions. I don't know what that is. Sharon, do you want to throw some?
Yeah, I'm gonna help you
I was
moderate.
gonna say, if you want to throw some here.
Gonna help you moderate these a little bit. So, one of the ones that's a standout one is when you were talking about, the PREA and violate, Eighth Amendment, 14th Amendment violations. Christine, who's one of our great sisters out of Pennsylvania, is asking, what about the UN Declaration of Human Rights? And I can help answer this too. There's
I
only
was
one.
just gonna say that, Sharon. I feel like you could probably even answer that one.
Yeah, I do. I took courses in international human rights consulting, and got certified as a consultant, but basically only Article 5 really applies. And that one is, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. There sort of really is nothing else in the UN Declaration of Human Rights that would really apply. And Christine had also asked about Geneva Convention. It only applies to prisoners of war, I'm afraid. And it does mandate that prisoners of war must be separated. You cannot have males housed with females. But that we are not in a war situation, although, we could be. So you've got some other questions in the Q&A as well. So one from Kate I'm probably going to get this wrong, Terwilliger, is if single sex spaces are more a matter of practice than law in the United States, and women don't have actual law behind them, how then can trans identified males make a legal claim to women's spaces? If there is no legal claim for us, then is there how, there's no legal claim for them, right? So do you want to go for that one?
That I will be glad to jump into that, and I hope to. That's a very good question, and I hope to do it justice. So sex discrimination, in general, is subject to. So the way they look at laws, the courts look at laws and interpret it, is subject to intermediate scrutiny, which is somewhere between the government just has to come up with a good, justification, which is like rational basis, to all the way to strict scrutiny, which is like for race, where there's almost no circumstances in which there can be legal distinctions made on those basis. But sex is somewhere in the middle. So it's still very heightened. You have to have this very big justification for doing it. There has to be tailored to a specific objective. Gender identity, which is still a very amorphous and developing concept in the law, is also now beginning, subject to strict scrutiny. Intermediate scrutiny. There are people who want to make it more of a strict scrutiny, so a higher thing. So yes, you can make distinctions between sex, but you can't treat people with gender identities, or however that's interpreted and defined in different places, subject differently. And so as a matter of practice, I mean, there's just it really, I was speaking in generalities too, because there's federal, there's state, is there a mandate versus is there a funding issue? And it's a lot of it, we know there's a lot of cultural pressure on there. And so it's, some of it is, we've always done things this way. We might thought of legal and who makes it to the court first, who makes it to the legislature first. And so I know that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but that was a very good question, is if we don't have, and there are some, we look at Title IX, we're going to have a thing next week talking about it, but that's a good example. It prohibits sex discrimination. And then it has carve outs from that prohibition saying you can't discriminate. Everyone has to be treated equally, regardless of sex, but we can have, women's and girls sports teams and sports leagues. And you can have sex separated bathrooms. You can have those things. And obviously we know those are all things that are under attack right now. But back when we knew what sex was, for sure, that was how it was carved out. And so that's kind of a good way of looking at it, is not everything has this prohibition on sex discrimination, and we have a lot of leeway. Some of that, some of that's built into law. So if anyone's familiar with the Equality Act in the UK, where they actually have sex as like an overarching category over a lot of things, the way that's built is a lot how intermediate scrutiny works here in a lot of ways. So where, depending on how it is, if sex isn't supposed to matter, then you can't discriminate based on it. But if there's reason to recognize sex, pretty good reason, then you can make those distinctions. And so we just have to be careful. There's a lot of movement towards wanting to have this stricter scrutiny because of, some perceptions of different benefits and stuff. But what we're seeing is that it really weakens all other arguments about why we need single sex spaces. Because here you can't say that you can't have any distinction based on sex and then also say, but we need to really, really protect, the notion of sex-based rights is based on that level of scrutiny. I know that was a very legal nerd answer.
It's a very legal answer. Okay.
I know. It's like, so I didn't put it in. Aaron, can you translate for me?
Right. So Christine put a few questions in here, and there's a couple that they're sort of related, along with a question from Jody Bruscato. So first of all, can you redo the stats? Can you reiterate the stats on Tim's in the prisons? And yeah. And how many of those, are the sexual offenders, right? And then how many are convicted, how many sex offenders in the women's prisons, et cetera. And the follow-on question to that is, do we have data on how many incarcerated women have been harmed by the men incarcerated with them? It would be really hard to get that, but yeah, do we have
Yeah, I
to?
was just, this is exactly what I was thinking, is like how, like, define harm too. I mean, specifically, we're certainly going to end up having some visibility on things that are documented. It's not something that they're providing claims on, but things like the number of uh, PREA complaints, so complaints about sexual assault or harassment. We'll know how many complaints were made, how many were substantiated, things like pregnancies. I am hoping to also get information on STDs and HIV and some things like that, but it's more concrete stuff. Harm, I mean, there's a lot of harm going on that is difficult to document, would be difficult to quantify. I mean, where arguably is just everyone who's in there is affected. But the stats. So 1/3 in California of trans identified men are sex offenders. 1/3 of those being transferred are also sex offenders. So that is consistent with the overall population. It might be a touch higher. And what we are also seeing is that the number of people who identify as transgender has gone up. I think it was 234% since 2017. And even just looking from the day the bill went into effect, that created these gender ID policies, which was January 1st, 2021. On that day, there was under 1,000, and now there are like 1,700. So that's 3 years later, and we're just looking at, that's just since, yes, Liz, 234%. I think, I don't remember where I got that from, but I'm not making that number up because I remember thinking 234. It was just the other day. Yeah, it's absurd. Which
Well,
is why no wonder, even the Bureau of Prisons was like, oh yeah. So that's that. And those numbers we have back as early as 2009 from a UC Irvine study, was the first one that really noted that. And they were studying the population, obviously, in the men's prisons. They were just gathering a bunch of stuff. It was a very neutral study. They were looking at characteristics of, including what they're serving criminally for. I want to highlight that this is not necessarily the most, it's not to say that 2/3 of them are not a danger, because what we are seeing is a lot of the names that come up of men who are causing great harm are not sex offenders, not registered sex offenders, or not convicted of sex crimes. But as we know, many men who commit crimes do not get caught
Yeah,
or
because
are
they
not punished.
just didn't get busted for it, doesn't mean they aren't doing that, right?
Yeah,
So, or
exactly.
convicted for
So,
it, because that's the other piece of it. So the
right.
follow-on question to that then, is, so if there's a man that's transferred into a woman's prison, and by the way, the stats you cite, especially about the 1,700 requests, are consistent, right? So our lovely Hannah Sullivan got a call from inside the Chowchilla facility here in California, from a male worker there, and he reported to her there were 500 men in the queue to transfer, right, into the women's facility. So these numbers make sense, is what I'm saying. So if a man in the women's prison rapes a woman and impregnates her, the Department of Corrections still considers him a man and won't transfer him over to the male prison?
So the problem is when you say a person can choose their sex, and if a woman sexually assaults another woman, they don't respond by moving her to the men's facilities. And so their position on it, which is in the law as well, that cannot be the only basis for moving it. So there's stuff in the law there about if there's security and management concerns, it mirrors the language that's in the Prison Rape Elimination Act and stuff. But functionally, they say you can't discriminate based on anatomy, you can't discriminate based on all this. And they also say you can't discriminate based on a factor that is present at that facility. So one of those things that has come up, what's a factor? Well, being convicted of rape is probably one that we would think of as being, there's not anyone convicted of forcible rape, which requires using a penis, in the women's facility, except they have transferred them over. So now that is a factor that is present. There. So, oh, and then the other, yes, but those are public stats too. So what that healthcare worker had reported was, yeah, they do the public stats. They have California keeps a FAQ on their website, SB 132 FAQs. It'll come up if you Google it. And they have up to date numbers on requests and transfers, and it's all they're very upfront about all of it. It's they're proud of it. They predicted it after the bill passed and before it went into effect. They said, and we predict there's going to be a lot more, prisoners identifying as transgender because our bill is so great. It's going to make them feel safe to come out and do this. They said this. They said it online and publicly. And the other stats that, just to reiterate in case this was what is that, 50% of federal prisoners who identify as transgender are sex offenders.
Got it.
Also, didn't mention this, but so many people have probably heard that trans identified prisoners are at increased risk of being victims of sexual assault. That is true by the numbers. They are also more at risk of perpetrating sexual assault by those same numbers. Can't just believe one and not the other.
Right.
In the federal system, they do annual PREA audits. The Bureau of Prisons does, which is just for the federal prisons. So it's not for the states. They do their own audits, but they look at a lot of numbers and they publish case studies of all substantiated claims every year. And I think maybe when you post this, we can stick the links to those in the description so people can see it, because it's very illuminating. Almost all victims of sexual assault and harassment who are trans identified are also sex offenders. And sex offenders are the most special needs population in terms of risk of sexual assault. Between 50 and 60% of victims of sexual assault in men's facilities are convicted sex offenders. And the feds track this. So, and when you look at their case studies, they say they have race, they have sex. I mean, they'll say transgender female, but they mean, they mean a man. And so they give you that information for the perpetrator, for the victim, and they tell you if they're convicted of a sex offense. And so all you just got to open this up and look at it, and you can see almost all of them. And then when you're talking about a population, again, at the federal level, it's 50%. You really got to ask yourself, what is the risk factor? Because, if anything, based on that, they're almost doing better than the non-trans identified sex offenders by the number. I mean, not that any of the sex offenders are doing very good, and no one deserves to be sexually assaulted. That's not what we should hope for. In general, that is not going to heal people and stop them from doing it in the future. Only locking them up will. But I don't know if that is illuminating or not. But really, I'm not a statistician, and I haven't been able to. Maybe if anyone is a statistician, email me, because I want to know if these numbers look how they look, because to me it looks like they're doing better than the other population. So
I agree.
Karen's laughing at me.
Right. So here's another question for you, which I think changing tack a little bit, and that is, do you have suggestions? So this is more on the freedom of speech, right? Do you have suggestions for navigating situations where we are expected to use incorrect pronouns for people, trans identified people, such as in the workplace or healthcare facilities?
In the workplace, that's a big one. So many people have probably heard in general, we don't have the same workplace protections in terms of being able to assert like a First Amendment right in the same way, which I do want to say that depending on your risk aversion, there's recourse. People can be fired for no reason, but they can't be fired for any reason, because there's lots of illegal reasons why you can't fire people. And so that's where one of the things we've seen with public employers, there's been a lot of pushback on things, but also to the extent something's based on religion, or it's been argued it's based on religion, being able to say, well, it's against my religious beliefs to kind of use these made up, I use sex-based pronouns because that's what my beliefs are. And we've wanted to really push the secular side of that too, that people have a right to not be forced to use someone else's spiritual terms. It's not disrespectful of someone else's beliefs to not share them. And so I think that one of the I'm not your lawyer, and this is not legal advice. This is just my observations and thoughts, um, at your own risk. But I think proactively addressing the issue is very protective compared to not. Making, again, this is something, if you are at a place of less vulnerability, or if you're comfortable taking on additional risk, trying to influence policy in the workplace, doing education as to the law, education as to the popularity. Wolf's done polling, it's on our website, and showing them how unpopular these positions are, because that's not what they're hearing from groups that advocate to them for a living. HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, they have the Corporate Equality Index. So they have a whole big project that's devoted to basically assigning scores and doing different things that there's people whose job it is at some of these big companies to like make sure they have a good corporate equality index score. And a lot of it is just throwing women down the toilet on some of that stuff. And then there's good stuff too, because as an afterthought, these groups also want to protect sexual orientation, but pales in comparison to the efforts to, you know, hurt women. And so, yeah, I think that that's a big thing, is being proactive. Also, just because you've had adverse action taken against you, just because you've been fired, don't assume that you have no recourse. You should look into it. One of the things we're looking at is sex discrimination. So this is something that's being explored, and the EEOC has not rejected this argument. The argument is being allowed to move forward on a case-by-case basis. That, sort of like, it's not very credible to say someone wasn't fired for being gay. They're only fired because they were in a pride parade, right? Like, so you can't expect that someone's just going to be in the closet. And so the equivalent to it is basically saying that you're allowed to do things and function as your sex. And so we're trying to push the envelope. That's a big thing we're trying to do. And that's, what I meant when I said we got the practical perspective. We've got these safety issues with women who are incarcerated, and these women who have nowhere to go. And then also we have to push back on the other level. We have to push back against allowing people to change sex in the law, and against, letting these language things go, and doing this. So it's really like a multi-front war in that regard.
Interesting. So, we've talked about this before, and I think it's an interesting thing to continue to talk about, is that there's one thing about being forced in the general public, right? To be, to say, to have to, be compelled to use someone's pronouns because it is interfering with your free speech rights. But there are no free speech rights in the corporate workplace. That basically your employer does have the right to regulate your speech in the workplace. And so that is one place in which, some folks that really are struggling a little bit, with being able to push back against kind of this imposition top down of the change of language. So Chanel brings up, though, how does it differ if you work for the government? Right. So, for example, the city of Boston expects people to accommodate pronouns. So could someone get away, could a bureaucracy get away with not doing it?
So, and that's where you get into, again, those who are familiar with the UK, the Equality Act, you got into the balancing of different things. So once you've made gender identity or transgender status like a category of protectedness, then what you have is balancing against it. So that's where you've had a lot of successful claims, especially when you have teachers and things like that, because you also have that extra layer of, there's basis for academic freedom. But for the cities, I mean, their argument back is that they have an obligation to protect other people, members of the public or other employees from discrimination, that is considered a form of, they consider that a form of discrimination. So it's really just pushing back and showing the opposite and showing that this is actually harm. It's really similar to, not having protected speech, but you could say, oh, I'm a Christian, that's my religion and all of that, but you can't say, you could maybe say, we don't want people to talk about religion in the workplace, but you can't say that some people can talk about religion and some people can't, or you're going to kind of have these different sort of things. And so that's one of the really great areas of speech, is having parity, equality on types of speech being protected. And that is something I would like to see people fight.
Fair enough. Okay. And then, what else did I want to tell you? I wanted to see if we've got, let me look at this next one. So what about in law, the material facts in dispute, right? So, you want to
From a
comment
lawyer,
on
isn't it?
that? It's from Shannon. Here she. So, what about that, about material facts in dispute, right?
In the sense of like, we're arguing over what's accurate factually, like yeah,
Yeah, I mean, if
I
that's a
mean,
giant male in front of me, right? There's a material fact in dispute,
yeah.
right? I'm being asked to call him a woman, right? When everybody and their brother can see it's clearly a male, right? Is that a
Mhm.
material fact in dispute?
So only the most extreme arguments say so, but they're fairly powerful entities. The ACLU is our favorite nemesis on that. They like to say that sex is a material fact in dispute. Usually, when you're arguing against the government on things like the state, they're just more like mushier about it. And they're just like, well, and won't necessarily come out and say things like sex is a spectrum. Sometimes they do. But yeah, that is a huge issue. I think perjury is a huge issue, making people say stuff under oath, not just in testifying, but even signing documents, for court and stuff, saying, having to say he or she when that's not what they believe. And it's another thing I think people should push back on more. But again, if you're in a situation where you're testifying, there's stakes, whether or not you're maybe a victim or perpetrator, accused perpetrator, right, of wrong think or some other thing, or just a witness. Like that's a lot of stakes on there. You can get your own legal trouble or things like that. But it's a huge deal. There's a case, U.S. v. Varner, in the Fifth Circuit. Um, it's the only federal court that has explicitly weighed in on this issue of like mandated speech in courts.
Mhm.
Uh, and it was in our favor. And they declined to order uh, mandated pronoun usage for this male pedophile who demanded it. Um, this decision was met around the country with tantrums all around from different bar associations who felt it was super mean, and proceeded to write various think pieces for their members on why they should not listen to it. And in practice, we've mostly seen, even though there hasn't been a case that's dealt with it, we've mostly seen judges be on the side of false realities and, you know, being kind and nice to people, even when those material facts are in dispute. So, um,
Okay. So a couple other questions. So let's shift gears a little bit to Planet Fitness. Now, this is an interesting one because Planet Fitness in Alaska, right? Kind of went absolutely globally viral because the woman took a video of a man shaving in the ladies' room. And Planet Fitness's corporate policy is to allow people to use whichever locker room is that they identify with, right? And so, this thing sort of went really, really viral. Now, what's interesting about it is our board member, Margot, called me and she was mad that the Planet Fitness in Virginia had a similar situation. But Virginia had passed a law that required people be able to use the bathroom of their choice, right? Whereas Alaska, which is where the original Planet Fitness thing went down, did not have that law. It was actually a corporate policy. And when Planet Fitness was put on, pressure, right, about what the heck is wrong with you that you have this corporate policy to let anybody into any bathroom they identify with, Planet Fitness actually doubled down on that policy, right? Or at least their person on social media did. And, you know, and actually doubled down and said, yeah, it's totally our policy to do that. So question that Christine has for you is, you know, if a city or county or state has a law, so like not Virginia, where they said anybody can go into the bathroom they want, but if they have a law designating single sex spaces, how can Planet Fitness's policy be legal? It's corporate policy. I mean, we may have the situation soon in Ohio, right? If they pass the single sex bathroom bill,
I
right? That
mean, yeah, it's that's just that goes back into that. It's the whims of whatever entity. If there's I mean, it's a nationwide organization, but if you're talking about, it's going to be subject to state laws for the most part. So if you have states that are silent on it, then you have them doing whatever they want. If you have states that require them to throw women under the bus, then you're going to have them doing that. And if they have protections for women, then they're going to have that. And so um, I think that's a huge deal. There's a lot of cowardice and a lot of false assumptions about what the people believe and want. And I think that I found that education um, of these organizations on some of these things, I'm thinking more specifically in the sports context of like some of these beyond Title IX, but actually to like the professional sports realms, a lot of those sporting bodies, they're, you know, I think there's a lot of education about what people really believe. They think that it's a different thing. They think it's like a right versus left thing, or
we
they
do.
think like a generational thing. And I even think that's really kind of like not borne out in the numbers. There's some generational change, but really just mostly people are fairly common sense. And then there's a very loud minority of activists who are very plugged in on social media, and they are plugged into the NGOs, you know, and so they're given money and volunteering and promoting different groups doing these things. And I think that.
I think that's fair too. So we have a couple of more operational questions here that I'll take. And one of them is from Gretchen Schwartz, and this is a really good question. She finds a lot of people do not understand why this issue is so important. I think it comes from a lack of education. Lauren, you're just kind of alluding to that. There are people reframing it as like sort of this hard left right situation and not even willing to engage. I just had lunch with somebody today that was the exact scenario. And so, and there's a feeling that some of this is coming from the way media themselves are shaping this up, right? The way silo reporting is going on, and has been for some time. So Gretchen shared our open letter to NPR, you know, to explain, you know, kind of how this is working. And what are other ways that we can educate on this issue without scaring them away, right? So the good news is we have a lot of options in that front, right? So our sisterhood community engagement manager, Mary, is putting together a course on how to land op-eds in local media. We've just been landing quite a few. We have some sisters that have gone through some training to be able to do some media work, and they're actually starting to land op-eds in media markets. So Chanel's on the call. She's landed one. We have another sister from Massachusetts, Karen, that landed one. Margot, our board member, just landed one in Virginia. And so, you know, the good news is the more of these voices land, it's easier to peak your local market than it is to change national opinion, right? So, you know, if you have like a local newspaper, they need eyeballs because eyeballs get them advertising, and advertising is revenues, and that's how they stay afloat, and they pay cub reporters. So a lot of times they're looking for content that's going to kind of gin up the public. And so if you're able to write op-eds that get those kinds of eyeballs, then we'll let you run them again and again and again, right? To write more op-eds. So letters to the editor and op-eds also turn out to be one of the most accepted, most read sections, I think, right behind the obituaries, actually, in any newspaper. And again, local newspapers need this kind of thing, like Village Voices and little independent weeklies and whatever. They need this exact sort of content. So one of the ways that you can raise awareness around this is don't go and beat up on the New York Times, although that seems to have worked, by the way. They've gotten more balance, or don't go beat up on, you know, Pink News or whatever. Go and start peaking people in your local community. That's an easier lift, and it actually gets a lot further in terms of waking people up. And Liz was asking if you have any anecdotes, right, that you can share, you know, that kind of exemplify some of the problems that we've been talking about tonight. I know you've given some examples of, you know, folks that we're working with in these situations, but do you have any anecdotes you want to share?
Yeah. Liz, since I know you know a lot of anecdotes, is there other things you were getting at? Yeah. I mean, there's so many. I think in the prison context, there's just um yeah, we've heard about everything from exhibitionism and voyeurism, which is very difficult to do anything about, um, even if you can prove it in a correctional context, to full on forcible rape. Um, and so that is something, that is a really big deal. We were aware of the the man who's been accused of rape now, who's getting the criminal charges in California, is he's actually one of the interveners in the case. He's the ACLU's client. And so that is going to be very interesting to see how that turns out, from that perspective as well, just from challenging the law and kind of having one of the poster boys of why this is supposed to be working out great to and there's just a lot. There's, we kind of have profiles of a lot of the guys in there just to keep an eye on them, and there's a lot of stuff behind it. I mean, a lot of times these are men who have spent decades sometimes in men's prisons without women. So not only they go like, a little cuckoo from that, and I don't mean that in a boys will be boys way. I just mean like it's a huge culture shock too, going from living with all men to all women. They're not used to they've developed a view in their head of what women are like. And so I think a lot of there are men who transfer who genuinely don't go in there intending, from what I can tell, to like cause havoc. But so those are some of the first ones to cause havoc, to be honest, is because especially if they go in there thinking they're gonna have a bunch of girlfriends and, oh, I'm gonna be so loved, and then they don't get along, and so I think there's really a lot of that. There's violence, there's intimidation and threats of violence. There's retaliation for reporting issues. We've talked about issues before with the woman who was uh, had one of these guys peeping on her in the bathroom, because when you're in prison you can't have bathroom privacy. So there was a bathroom in the day room of, where there's no locks because they have to be able to go in and get you. There's a window where they can look in and see you because the guards have to be able to look in and see people in the bathroom. So this guy who was pretending to basically be hard of hearing, and so can't knock because he can't hear what people say. That was kind of the alibi there, was peeking in, right? And so he was doing it this one woman multiple times, and then both times when she came out, he did not then use the bathroom even. And so it was really not even just I had to see if someone was in there. And she had filed a paperwork against it, and so did two witnesses, including one of the plaintiffs, Tamikia Johnson, had filed complaints as well, as witnesses to these incidents. And they were all removed from the honor dorm and accused of lying, even though it was caught on videotape, because, there was some real like micro or like, nitpicking of some of the details. And so things like, oh, he was looking for, and I don't recall, like remember the exact numbers, but it was something like, oh, he was looking in there for a minute, but then it turned out to be like 15 seconds or something. Well, 15 seconds is a very long time to stand there and look in the window at someone in the bathroom, right? You should just need to boop, peek, oh, someone's in there, and things like that. And they had initially ruled it as unfounded allegations, which is a huge deal because there's just when there's a complaint like that, it can either be substantiated, meaning someone confessed or we have video, or we were otherwise able to prove that this happened, or unfounded on the other end, which means we proved it didn't happen. We proved it was a false report and nothing happened. But the vast majority of complaints are unsubstantiated, which just means we couldn't make a conclusive determination. So it is extremely unusual. And we talked to an expert, someone who helped write the state PREA regulations, who said she had never heard of such a thing. Even if it was unfounded, the idea of them getting such severe consequences. One element of that was one of the witnesses, who was a trans-identified woman, so who identified as a transgender man, and had been shoved by the perpetrator, who was a 6 foot tall, 6'4", scary man, who identifies as a woman, and the the video of the incident, you couldn't see the contact. It was where the shove was. You could see that it happened. And the comment from the prison was that um, that it was clear that any contact was incidental and perhaps unintentional. So it's like not even like they had video showing it didn't happen. They just said, oh, it looked like it was an accident. So for that to be unfounded as opposed to substantiated or even unsubstantiated at the worst is absurd. And we had experts telling us as such. So that was eventually dropped. But the woman who was the victim of the peeping lost her parole over it. And she had been found suitable for parole. And then this happened in between that and her being released. And she was accused of doing this as harassment on the basis of transgender status. That was dropped. And she still went back to when she had to go back before the parole board again. They still didn't like how she handled the situation. They thought she unfairly focused on this man's gender identity and transgender status and used dehumanizing language. And she has been rolled over for another 5 years. So she was about to get out, and now she's stuck there for years and years more with time to build up further. So this is what's happening.
So it's retaliatory. It's they're retaliating and further
Yeah.
punishing and punishing women extra. That's very consistent with we've had some phone calls on this subject, right? And that's very consistent with that too, that any woman that complains loses privileges. That was also in the Office of the Inspector General of California's report, right? That prisoners are now afraid to complain, right? Because they've seen loss of privileges, loss of sleeping accommodations, things like that. So it seems like it's moving into almost cruel and inhuman punishment sort of area, right?
I mean, we knew it was when they passed. I mean, we told them that when they put the law forth. Wolf testified and spoke about all of that. And so all we can say now is duh. Like there's literally, unfortunately, nothing that's happened that we didn't foresee, and so they basically don't care. And that's why we're suing them. Someone mentioned in the comments, woman to woman. Yeah. Anyone who doesn't follow them should follow them too. That's Amy Ichikawa's group, and they do reentry services. They got drafted into this, unfortunately, because every other women's org in California working with incarcerated women is totally captured. And so, but she's in touch with them constantly and they do really good work. And that's one of the casualties of things like this is then you have groups that are wanting to be focused on things like helping women prepare for parole boards and helping them, get to where they're going when they're released, and they're forced to, work on this kind of stuff. And that's, for Wolf, that's a huge thing. Like we could be focusing on massive problems with like porn and male violence in general. And then it's like, this is such an existential issue and causing so many other issues. It feels like they're throwing something on purpose to distract us from, or not distraction, but you know what I'm saying, Sharon.
I totally do understand what you're saying. So, all right, last question, then we'll let it go. We have to kind of close it out. And thank you everybody for hanging with us because this has been really, really good. So, one of the questions Chanel is asking, and it's I'm going to put two parts of this question together. So first of all, if we find out that there's a male that's going, he's done terrible things and he's raped somebody, and is in the male's prison, and now he's going to transfer to the female prison, right? So how could we protest? How could we find out about that? How could we do something to in some way thwart this path? I know in California that's a train, right? And it's a well-loaded train stacked in the guy's favor, actually, with like 6 appeals that are guaranteed to come out his way. But I'm just curious, is there something, does protest work? Is there anything we can do to stop a person like that transferring into a female prison? I mean, like, what if it was like this? And we've actually seen cases, right, where it's like a 4-time convicted, horrible, rapist, and he's going straight into the women's.
Yeah, I think often by the time you're hearing about it, so a lot of these, protesting's never going to hurt, you know, bringing attention to it, bringing attention to what's going on, bringing attention to the impact, bringing attention to the policy itself. All of those are good things in public awareness. So I do think once by the time you've heard that, it's usually because especially if it's like you just said, Sharon, you know, you've got all these things and he's been fighting. Usually the policy side of it is often very baked in. So I think a big thing is letting your most states are not doing the right thing on this, including, you know, we think of, oh, you know, like South Dakota is very, you know, red state, you would think like not progressive on this issue at all. But not only do they have cross-sex housing in there, they actually reclassify you as female if you've had surgery. So they're not even considered like transgender under state regulations. They're just lost to, and they say if it's surgery doesn't have to be genital surgery. You could get breast implants as a man and be considered female and be entitled to. So I think letting your state know where you stand, whether that's your elected officials, whether that's the you know regulatory, the administrative agency responsible for doing these things, is a big deal. And certainly like op-eds and things like that. But also, you know, I think there's the power of getting connected. So yeah, joining up with, you know, being a sister in action if you're a sister, and and donating so that we can kind of or donating your time so that these things can all, the power of togetherness to beat these things, and sharing information and things like that. Talking to people in your life too is a big deal. We can peak a lot more people that we know in person than anonymous people in the internet. Have a lot more success with that. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. This was great. We should do this again.
And MK's putting in a pitch for WBOR, which was just vetoed in
Yes.
Arizona, just vetoed tonight in Arizona. It just
Oh,
happened.
he did do that.
Yeah, I knew Hobbs was going to. I just was waiting, you know, today was the day. Anyway, there's tons of resources and information on our website. Thank you all for hanging out with us this evening. As Lauren mentioned, we are going to be doing another panel in a week's time, and this will be all about Title IX. And it is a huge deal, so we will get you invites out for that shortly. Thank you all for coming this evening. And, you know, if you need assistance, please look on our website. Please reach out to us, email us. Tons of information. It was lovely. And Lauren, thank you so much for worrying and talking about women with nowhere to go.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.